The guard and the gate. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting long golden shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of the Grand Palace. Tourists milled about, their cameras clicking incessantly as they captured the stately grandeur of the scene. Towering columns and ornate gates spoke of a history steeped in tradition, a history that the royal guard was entrusted to preserve. Among the crowd, a single figure stood out, not for his reverence or quiet appreciation, but for his sheer audacity. He was a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a loud Hawaiian shirt that clashed with the dignified surroundings. His shorts revealed knotty knees, and his face bore a smug smirk, as if he owned the very air around him. His name was Derek, and he thrived on being the center of attention. Derek sauntered toward the main gates, where two royal guards stood like sentinels, their polished uniforms immaculate, their gazes fixed forward. They were statuesque, almost inhuman in their stillness, as if they had been carved from the very stones beneath their feet. The crowd observed with quiet admiration, marveling at the guards' discipline. For many, this display was a symbol of strength, dignity, and history, a living reminder of values that transcended time. But for Derek, it was an opportunity. Well, he muttered to no one in particular, his voice dripping with derision. This is your famous royal guard, huh? Nothing but props in fancy costumes. His words drew a few glances, but most people ignored him, not wanting to engage. Derek, however, thrived on provocation. He strutted closer to one of the guards, his sneakers squeaking against the stone, as he came to a halt just inches away. "You there," Derek barked, leaning in slightly. "Do you even understand what I'm saying, or are you just a mannequin in a uniform?" The guard didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, staring past Derek as though the man didn't exist. This non-reaction was Derek's fuel. He smirked, his eyes narrowing with mischief. "Hey, buddy, I'm talking to you." Derek's voice grew louder, drawing the attention of those nearby. The crowd began to murmur, their collective unease palpable. Still, the guard did not move. His silence was more powerful than words, a quiet defiance that spoke volumes. To Derek, it was infuriating. "You think you're better than me, huh?" Derek sneered, stepping even closer. His face was now mere inches from the guard's, his hot breath brushing against the man's unyielding expression. "Standing here all day, pretending to be something you're not. What a joke." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Derek's words were crossing into dangerous territory. A woman near the front whispered to her companion, "Someone should stop him. This is going too far." But Derek was emboldened by the attention. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms wide, as if addressing an audience at a comedy show. "Look at this guy. Not even a blink. I could set off fireworks in front of him, and he'd still just stand there." A smattering of nervous laughter emerged, though most remained silent, their discomfort evident. Some began filming the exchange on their phones, capturing the unfolding drama. Derek pivoted back to the guard, his tone growing harsher. "You think your silence makes you strong. It doesn't. It makes you weak. Real men speak up. Real men don't hide behind some outdated uniform." For the first time, there was a subtle shift in the air. It wasn't something tangible. There was no movement, no expression. But something in the guard's presence seemed to solidify further, like steel being tempered under fire. The crowd felt it too. A hush fell over them, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. All eyes were on the guard, and the man trying so desperately to provoke him. "You know what?" Derek sneered, leaning even closer. "I think you're scared. That's it, isn't it? You're afraid to say anything because you know you're nothing. Just another puppet in the system." His words hung in the air, heavy with contempt. And yet, the guard did not react. His gaze remained steady, his posture impeccable. It was as if he had become one with the very ground he stood on, unshakable and eternal. Derek's frustration boiled over. He raised his hand, bringing it within inches of the guard's face, snapping his fingers loudly. "What's wrong, buddy? Cat got your tongue. The crowd stirred uneasily. Some murmured protests, while others watched with bated breath, unable to tear their eyes away. A young man near the back muttered, "This is disgusting. Someone should stop him." But Derek was too far gone to notice. He had convinced himself that he was in control, that he was the one with the power. He began circling the guard, his insults growing more venomous with each step. "Look at him," he said loudly, addressing the crowd. "He thinks this uniform makes him special. Newsflash, pal, it doesn't. You're just a guy standing around, playing dress-up." The guard's silence was unrelenting, a wall that Derek couldn't breach. It wasn't indifference. It was discipline, an unyielding commitment to a code of conduct that Derek couldn't begin to comprehend. And that was what infuriated him most. Derek stopped in front of the guard again, his face red with anger. "You're pathetic," he spat. "Standing there, letting me say whatever I want. You're not a man. You're a coward." For a moment, the crowd held its breath. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation, as if the entire square was waiting for something to happen. But the guard didn't move. His silence was deafening, a testament to a strength that went beyond mere words. And for the first time, Derek hesitated. Provocation meets resilience. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder as the tension reached a boiling point. Derek's face twisted with frustration as his attempts to humiliate the guard were met with nothing but stoic silence. He had thrown every insult he could muster, each one laced with venom. Yet the man before him stood unmoving, unyielding, a symbol of discipline and dignity that Derek could neither understand nor tolerate. Derek took a step back, surveying the guard with narrowed eyes. He raised his arms dramatically and turned to the crowd. "Look at this guy," he shouted, his voice dripping with derision. "He thinks he's better than all of us, standing there like he's some kind of statue. But he's not. He's just a man too scared to fight back." The crowd shifted uneasily. Many averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. Others whispered to one another, their voices a mix of condemnation and disbelief. But some, those who thrived on chaos, egged Derek on, their phones raised to capture every moment of his performance. "Maybe he doesn't even understand me," Derek continued, sneering. "Maybe he's just a glorified mannequin. Is that it, pal? Are you just here to look pretty for the tourists?" Still, the guard did not move. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, his posture a picture of perfection. Every fiber of his being radiated calm and control, a silent defiance that spoke louder than any words ever could. Derek's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, I get it," he said, his tone mocking. "You think this makes you strong, don't you? Standing there, letting me say whatever I want. But it doesn't. It makes you weak." He stepped closer, invading the guard's personal space. His voice dropped to a low hiss, meant only for the man before him. "You're nothing. Just a guy in a silly uniform, pretending to be important. You're a joke." The crowd gasped as Derek suddenly reached out, his hand hovering just inches from the guard's chest. He waved his fingers tauntingly, testing the boundaries of the man's restraint. The guard remained unmoving, his eyes focused ahead, as if Derek didn't exist. "See that?" Derek called out to the crowd, his voice triumphant. "He's a coward. He won't even flinch." A woman near the front of the crowd stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Enough," she shouted. "Leave him alone. He's just doing his job." Derek turned to her, his expression a mix of annoyance and amusement. "Doing his job," he repeated mockingly. "Standing there like a statue is his job. That's the problem with people like him. They think wearing a uniform makes them better than everyone else." The woman glared at him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You're the problem," she shot back. "You think bullying someone makes you strong. It doesn't. It makes you pathetic." Derek's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. He stepped toward the woman, his voice rising. "And what are you going to do about it, huh? You think you're so tough?" Before the confrontation could escalate further, an older man in the crowd stepped between them. His voice was calm but firm. "That's enough," he said. "You're embarrassing yourself." Derek hesitated, his eyes darting between the older man and the woman. For a moment, it seemed as though he might back down. But then he turned back to the guard, his frustration boiling over. "You think they can save you?" He spat. "You think hiding behind your silence makes you untouchable?" He leaned in closer, his face inches from the guards. "You're not untouchable," he hissed. "You're nothing." And with that, he raised his hand and snapped his fingers directly in the guard's face. The crowd erupted into gasps and murmurs. Some people shouted for Derek to stop, while others simply stared, their phones capturing every second. But the guard remained motionless, his expression unchanging. Derek's frustration reached a fever pitch. He stepped back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If you won't respond, I'll just have to get your attention another way." He turned to the crowd, his smirk returning. "Let's see how far I can push him," he announced. "Maybe then he'll show us what he's really made of." The air grew heavy with tension as Derek began circling the guard, his voice loud and mocking. He waved his arms dramatically, making exaggerated gestures as he continued his tirade. "You know what this reminds me of?" he said, addressing the crowd as if he were performing on a stage. "One of those cheesy wax museums. You know, the ones where the figures look real but don't do anything. That's what he is, a wax figure in a fancy costume." He stopped suddenly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the guard. "But even wax figures react if you melt them," he muttered, more to himself than to the crowd. And then, without warning, he reached out and tugged at the edge of the guard's uniform. The reaction was instantaneous, not from the guard, but from the crowd. A chorus of gasps and shouts erupted, and several people stepped forward, their expressions a mix of anger and disbelief. "You've gone too far," someone shouted. "Leave him alone," another voice called out, but Derek ignored them. His attention was fixed solely on the guard, whose stoic expression remained unchanged. "You're really something, aren't you?" Derek sneered. "Standing there, letting me do whatever I want. Do you even feel anything, or are you just a robot?" He reached out again, this time aiming for the guard's polished helmet. But before he could make contact, a voice rang out, a deep, commanding voice that cut through the chaos like a knife. "That's enough." The crowd fell silent, their heads turning toward the source of the voice. Standing at the edge of the square was another guard, his uniform identical to the one being targeted. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. Derek froze, his hand hovering in midair. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. "You've made your point," the second guard said, his tone measured but firm. "Now walk away." Derek hesitated, his gaze darting between the two guards. The crowd watched with bated breath, their collective tension palpable. For a moment, it seemed as though Derek might comply. But then his smirk returned, and he took a step toward the second guard. "Or what?" he challenged. "What are you going to do about it?" The guard didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, his voice calm. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about you. And you've already shown everyone here exactly who you are." The words hit Derek like a slap to the face. His smirk faltered, and he took a step back, his confidence shaken. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, began to murmur. Some people clapped softly, while others called out words of encouragement to the guards. Derek glanced around, his face reddening as he realized that the crowd was no longer on his side. He turned back to the first guard, his voice rising in desperation. "This isn't over," he said, pointing a finger at the man. "You think you've won, but you haven't." The guard remained silent, his expression unchanging. And in that silence, Derek saw the truth. He had already lost. breaking the unbreakable. The square hung in a thick electric silence, charged with the weight of Derek's defeated retreat. The crowd began to murmur in low voices, some urging him to leave, others filming with anticipation, waiting to see what would happen next. For many, the guard's silence was no longer a display of indifference. It had become a shield of dignity, a powerful statement that words and actions couldn't break. But Derek wasn't done. His pride had been wounded, and the jeering crowd felt like salt rubbed into an already festering wound. His hands clenched into fists, his face red with humiliation. He paced in a small circle, his mind racing for a way to salvage his dominance. The crowd, the guard, and even the second guard who had intervened, all of them had shifted the power away from him. And he couldn't stand it. With a sharp inhale, Derek spun around, his eyes fixed once again on the first guard. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he sneered, pointing an accusatory finger at the silent figure. "You think standing there, ignoring me, makes you some kind of hero." The guard's gaze remained fixed ahead, unflinching. His polished buttons glinted under the sunlight, and his stance was as steady as the stone walls of the palace itself. Derek's voice grew louder, fueled by his growing desperation. "No one's as calm as you're pretending to be," he shouted. "You're not a statue. You're a man, and men have breaking points. Let's see where yours is." The crowd stirred, their unease growing with each passing moment. Some whispered among themselves, expressing their disapproval. A middle-aged man near the front shook his head, muttering, "He's just embarrassing himself now." But others, drawn to conflict like moths to a flame, watched with morbid fascination. Derek strode closer, circling the guard with deliberate, predatory steps. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for the guard to hear. "You're not brave. You're a coward, hiding behind your uniform, pretending you're untouchable. But I know the truth. You're nothing without it." He stepped back, his chest heaving as he looked to the crowd. "Do you see this?" he shouted, gesturing toward the guard. "This is what they call strength. A man too afraid to defend himself." A young woman near the back shouted, "He's not afraid. He's stronger than you'll ever be." The words stung Derek like a slap to the face. He whirled around to face her, his eyes blazing. "Stronger? You call this strong?" he barked, pointing again at the guard. "This isn't strength. Strength is action. Strength is fighting back." But even as he spoke, Derek knew he was losing the crowd. The murmurs of disapproval were growing louder, the discontent spreading like wildfire. He could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him, suffocating and inescapable. "You want to see action?" Derek muttered, almost to himself. His gaze returned to the guard, and a dangerous glint flickered in his eyes. He took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them. The crowd's murmurs turned to gasps as Derek reached out, his hand brushing against the guard's polished shoulder epaulette. "Still nothing, huh?" Derek taunted, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and nervous energy. "Let's see how far you'll go to keep up this act." He suddenly grabbed the edge of the guard's uniform, tugging at it with enough force to pull the fabric taut. The crowd erupted in outrage, voices overlapping in a chaotic din. "Stop it," someone shouted. "Leave him alone," cried another. But Derek was too far gone. He grabbed the brim of the guard's iconic tall helmet and yanked it off, holding it triumphantly above his head. "Look at this," he bellowed, waving the helmet like a trophy. "Is this what makes him special? Without this, he's just another guy." The crowd recoiled in shock, their gasps echoing across the square. A young boy in the front row clutched his mother's hand, his wide eyes brimming with confusion and fear. The mother pulled him closer, her face twisted with anger and disgust. The guard, now bareheaded, remained motionless. His dark hair, slicked back with precision, glistened under the sunlight. Despite Derek's attempts to strip him of his dignity, the guard's presence remained as commanding as ever. his silence, his unshakable calm. It was a force stronger than Derek's rage could ever be. Derek sneered, dropping the helmet onto the cobblestone ground with a loud clatter. "There you go," he spat. "Now you're just like the rest of us." The crowd's disapproval turned into a roar. People shouted at Derek, their voices rising in anger. "You've gone too far." One man yelled, "Show some respect." A woman screamed, but Derek ignored them, his focus solely on the guard. "You're not so special now, are you?" Derek snarled. He raised his foot, poised to kick the helmet, when a voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Enough." It was the second guard. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate and measured. His gaze was locked on Derek, his expression calm but unyielding. "Step away," he said, his voice low and firm. "This ends now." Derek hesitated, caught off guard by the authority in the man's tone. He glanced at the crowd, then back at the second guard. For a moment, it seemed as though he might back down. But then he laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "What are you going to do?" he challenged. "Stand there and stare at me too." The second guard didn't respond. He simply stood his ground, his silence as powerful as his presence. The crowd fell silent, their attention shifting to this new confrontation. The air was thick with anticipation, every breath heavy with the weight of what might come next. Derek turned back to the first guard, his face twisted with frustration and desperation. "You're both the same," he spat. "Cowards hiding behind uniforms, too scared to stand up for yourselves." He reached down, grabbing the first guard's rifle. The crowd gasped, their collective shock palpable. But before Derek could pull it away, the guard's grip tightened. His hands, which had remained still for so long, moved with precision and control. The guard's eyes met Derek's for the first time, their steely gaze piercing through the man's bravado. In that moment, Derek froze. The raw strength in those eyes was undeniable, a silent declaration of resilience that no words could diminish. "You've lost," the second guard said quietly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Walk away before you lose any more." Derek's hand trembled on the rifle, his confidence shattered. The crowd watched in stunned silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. Finally, Derek let go. He stepped back, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. The first guard returned to his motionless stance, his rifle held firmly in his hands, his gaze once again fixed ahead. Derek turned to the crowd, his face a mask of humiliation. The people who had once watched him with morbid curiosity now looked at him with disdain. Their silence was louder than any words could have been. Without another word, Derek turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing across the cobblestones. The crowd parted for him, their eyes following him with quiet judgment. The square fell silent once more. The first guard stood tall, his dignity unbroken. The second guard stepped back into position, his presence a silent reassurance to the onlookers. And as the crowd began to disperse, a quiet respect filled the air. The guards, with their silence and restraint, had shown a strength that no words could match, a strength that would linger in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The strength within. The square, now quiet once more, seemed almost serene in the aftermath of the tense confrontation. The murmur of the dispersing crowd softened as people moved away, some casting backward glances at the royal guard who had stood unmoving, unyielding, and undefeated. Yet, amid this outward calm, a tempest brewed within the man who had borne the brunt of Derek's aggression. Behind his stoic expression, the guard's mind raced with a storm of emotions. The stinging words, the insults hurled like arrows, and the physical provocations all echoed in his thoughts, a cacophony that threatened to crack the walls of his composure. But his training had prepared him for this, for moments when silence was more powerful than speech, and discipline more formidable than retaliation. He could feel the tension in his muscles, the controlled tremble in his fingers that had gripped his rifle with such steadfast determination. He had wanted, more than anything, to respond, not with violence, but with the sheer force of his humanity. To shout, to glare, to remind the world that beneath the uniform and the discipline was a man with feelings, pride, and limits. But no, that was not his duty. The Royal Guard was not just a position or a job. It was a symbol. He was not merely representing himself, but an institution, a history, and an ideal. The uniform he wore was more than fabric. It was a legacy passed down through generations of men and women who had stood just as he had, unwavering in the face of ridicule, provocation, and even danger. To falter would not just be a failure of discipline. It would be a betrayal of everything that uniform represented. As the last of the crowd dispersed, the second guard stepped closer, his voice low and measured. "You all right?" It was a simple question, one that carried with it the weight of concern and camaraderie. The first guard didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Finally, he allowed himself the smallest of nods, a subtle acknowledgement that conveyed volumes. "I saw his hand on your rifle," the second guard continued, his voice tinged with quiet admiration. "You handled it well, better than most would." Again, the first guard said nothing. Words felt heavy in his throat, too cumbersome to form. Instead, he took a slow, deep breath, letting it ground him as his training had taught him to do. The second guard didn't press further. He understood. They all did. Every member of the Royal Guard knew the silent battle that came with their duty, the internal war between human instinct and professional discipline. It was a war fought every day, one that demanded not just strength but endurance. That evening, when his shift finally ended, the first guard retreated to the barracks, his steps measured and deliberate. The weight of the day seemed to press harder with every step, the lingering echoes of Direct's words following him like a shadow. The polished corridors of the barracks were a sanctuary of sorts, their quiet order a stark contrast to the chaos of the square. In the solitude of his quarters, he removed his helmet and uniform with practiced precision, carefully hanging each piece as if performing a sacred ritual. Each polished button, each crease in the fabric, held meaning. They were reminders of why he endured. Sitting on the edge of his narrow bed, he allowed himself to exhale deeply for the first time that day. His hands rested on his knees, his head bowed. The silence of the room was soothing, a balm for his frayed nerves. He thought of Derek's face, contorted with anger and smugness, desperate for a reaction. He thought of the crowd, their faces a mix of disapproval and fascination. Most of all, he thought of the boy near the front, the one who had clutched his mother's hand so tightly. What had that boy seen in him? Had he seen strength, dignity, or just a man standing still while another tried to tear him down? The thought lingered, heavy and unrelenting. The knock at his door startled him. He rose, opening it to find one of his fellow guards standing there, a man he'd known for years. "Mind if I come in?" the man asked. The first guard nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They sat in silence for a moment before the visitor spoke. "I saw the video," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "It's already all over social media." The first guard's jaw tightened. He had known this would happen. In this digital age, nothing remained private. His silence, his stillness, it was now a public spectacle, dissected by strangers who didn't know him, didn't know the weight of what he carried. "You should see the comments," the visitor continued, his tone softening. "They're calling you a hero." The first guard looked up, his expression skeptical. The visitor smiled faintly and pulled out his phone, scrolling for a moment before holding it out. "Here, read." Reluctantly, the guard took the phone. The screen was filled with posts, each one a testament to what people had seen and felt. Words like dignity, strength, and restraint leaped off the page, weaving a narrative he hadn't expected. One comment caught his eye. "This is what real strength looks like. Not the man shouting, but the one who stood silent and unbroken. A true inspiration." He read another. "The world needs more people like this guard. Calm, composed, and dignified even in the face of hatred." He's a reminder of what humanity should strive for. The words stirred something deep within him, a flicker of validation that he hadn't realized he needed. He handed the phone back, his expression unreadable. "You didn't just stand there," the visitor said, his voice firm but kind. "You showed everyone what strength really means. That man came at you with everything he had, and you didn't let him win. You were a wall he couldn't break." The first guard nodded slowly, the weight in his chest lifting ever so slightly. He didn't need to respond. His silence had already spoken for him. Later that night, as he lay in bed, his thoughts turned to the boy in the crowd once more. He hoped that boy had seen not weakness, but strength. Not submission, but resilience. And as sleep began to claim him, he made a quiet promise to himself. A promise to stand just as tall, just as unyielding, for as long as he was able. Because silence, he now understood, could be louder than any shout. And dignity, even when tested, was a shield no insult could pierce. The ripple effect. The following morning, the square outside the royal palace was as it always had been, a symbol of tradition and grandeur, its cobblestones gleaming in the pale sunlight. Yet, an unspoken energy hung in the air, a residue left behind by the events of the previous day. Tourists once again filled the space, snapping photos of the palace's towering gates and the steadfast guards who stood watch. But something had changed. Among the newcomers were those who had seen the viral video, drawn by curiosity and a quiet sense of reverence. The clip of the guard's confrontation with Derek had spread like wildfire across social media, amassing millions of views overnight. Headlines praised the guard's restraint, his composure under pressure, and his embodiment of dignity in the face of provocation. For many, the guard had become a symbol of silent strength, a man who chose peace over conflict, resolve over reaction. Yet, as the world buzzed with admiration, the man himself remained unaware of the scale of his newfound fame. Derek. Confronting himself. In a small apartment across town, Derek sat hunched over his laptop, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. His hands were clenched into fists, and his jaw tightened as he scrolled through the avalanche of comments on the viral video. The words hit him harder than he cared to admit. This guard is a true hero. It takes more strength to endure than to lash out. That guy harassing him. What a loser. Imagine needing to tear someone down just to feel big. The guard's silence said more than the other man's screaming ever could. Each comment felt like a dagger, twisting in Derek's gut. He had thought himself clever, powerful even, during his tirade. He had believed his words and actions would make him the center of attention, and they had, just not in the way he'd intended. The internet had turned on him, dubbing him the heckler and the loud fool. Memes of his exaggerated gestures and furious expressions circulated, each one mocking his arrogance. But it was the videos that stung the most. Watching himself shout and gesticulate like a petulant child, while the guard stood silent and composed, was a mirror he wasn't ready to face. Derek slammed the laptop shut and leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened screen. Tired, angry, and small, he thought of the guard, standing tall and unshaken despite the torrent of abuse. A pang of shame twisted in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. For the first time in years, Derek felt the weight of his actions. He had always prided himself on his ability to dominate a room, to be the loudest voice, the sharpest wit. But now, as he sat alone in his apartment, he realized the hollow truth. All the shouting in the world couldn't fill the emptiness inside. The guard. A day like any other. At the barracks, the guard prepared for another shift. His uniform was spotless, his rifle polished to perfection. Each movement was precise, a practiced ritual that brought a sense of order to the chaos of his thoughts. He had seen glimpses of the video, his fellow guards showing him snippets on their phones with quiet admiration. But he hadn't dwelled on it. Fame, if it could be called that, was irrelevant to him. What mattered was the uniform, the tradition, and the unspoken promise he had made the day he first stood in that square, to protect not just the palace, but the values it represented. As he stepped into position that morning, the familiar hum of the crowd greeted him. He stood tall, his gaze fixed ahead, his posture perfect. Yet there was a subtle difference in the air. People lingered a little longer, their expressions a mix of curiosity and respect. Some whispered to each other, pointing discreetly in his direction. A few offered quiet nods or smiles, gestures of gratitude he couldn't acknowledge but felt nonetheless. A young boy approached the edge of the crowd, clutching a small notebook. His mother stood beside him, encouraging him with a soft smile. After a moment of hesitation, the boy stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he held out the notebook toward the guard. The guard didn't move. He couldn't, but his heart softened at the sight. The boy's mother leaned down, whispering words of encouragement. The boy placed the notebook gently at the guard's feet before stepping back, his face flushed with pride. The notebook remained there until the end of the shift when another guard collected it. Later, in the quiet of the barracks, the guard opened it to find a simple note written in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for being strong. I want to be like you when I grow up." The words struck him deeply, more than any headline or viral video ever could. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what had happened, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. His actions, or lack thereof, had mattered. They had meant something to someone. The crowd. A lesson remembered. Among the crowd that day were those who had been present during Derek's tirade. One of them, an elderly woman with a walking stick, watched the guard with tearful eyes. She had been a child during wartime, her memories filled with images of soldiers who had stood tall in the face of adversity. Seeing the guard endure reminded her of those times, of the strength that came not from violence, but from resolve. Another observer, a young man with a camera slung around his neck, had initially filmed the incident for entertainment, but as he watched it unfold, he felt a deep sense of shame. He had shared the video online, not to mock, but to show others the strength of the guard's silence. Now, standing in the square once more, he felt a quiet determination to do better, to be better. Derek's return. In the days that followed, Derek wrestled with his conscience. The internet's backlash had shaken him, but it was the memory of the guard's unflinching composure that haunted him most. He had tried to break the man, to reduce him to nothing. Instead, he had been the one left exposed, fragile and small in comparison to the guard's towering strength. One afternoon, unable to ignore the gnawing guilt, Derek returned to the square. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes fixed on the guard. The man was as he had been before, still, silent, and unshakable. Derek felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to say something, to apologize, but the words stuck. How could he undo the damage he'd done? How could he earn forgiveness from a man who had already won without lifting a finger? He turned to leave, but as he did, he caught sight of the young boy with the notebook, standing with his mother. The boy looked up at Derek, his wide eyes filled with something Derek hadn't expected. Hope. Derek hesitated, then knelt down. "You look up to him, don't you?" he asked softly. The boy nodded. "He's a real hero," he said simply. Derek swallowed hard. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He is." For the first time in his life, Derek understood the power of humility. And as he walked away from the square, he made a silent vow to let the guard's strength inspire him to be better, not louder. A legacy of silence. The square at the royal palace became a symbol of something greater in the weeks following Derek's infamous tirade. The video of the silent confrontation had sparked not just outrage, but a global conversation about dignity, restraint, and the quiet strength it takes to endure. It was no longer just a moment captured on camera. It had become a movement. The guard, who had stood unmoving in the face of Derek's provocations, continued his duty as he always had. Day after day, he donned his uniform, stepped into position, and stood at attention, his gaze fixed ahead. To the tourists who visited, he was no longer just a part of the scenery. He was a symbol of something profound, a living reminder of the power of silence. The world reacts. Across the globe, the video inspired discussions in classrooms, boardrooms, and homes. Educators used it to teach students about self-control and resilience, while parents shared it with their children as an example of how to stand tall in the face of adversity. Psychologists dissected the interaction, pointing to the guard's ability to maintain composure as an example of emotional intelligence and professional discipline. In online forums and social media threads, people shared their own stories of moments when they had to choose between reacting and restraining themselves. Some recounted encounters with bullies or difficult coworkers. Others shared tales of standing up for their principles in the face of opposition. The guard's silent strength had touched something universal, a reminder that true power often lies in choosing not to retaliate. One particularly touching story came from a young woman who wrote, "I've always struggled with letting people's words get to me, but seeing this guard stand there, unshaken, reminded me that I don't have to react to every insult. His silence gave me courage." The boy with the notebook. The boy who had left the notebook at the guard's feet returned to the square every few days with his mother. Each time, he stood near the front of the crowd, his eyes wide with admiration as he watched the guards in their polished uniforms. He no longer saw them as just silent figures guarding the palace. He saw them as protectors, their stillness a testament to their strength. One day, after the guard shift had ended, the boy and his mother waited near the gates. When the guard finally emerged, dressed in his civilian clothes, the boy ran up to him, clutching another notebook. "Excuse me, sir," the boy called, his small voice carrying across the courtyard. The guard stopped, surprised. He looked down at the boy, who held out the notebook with trembling hands. "This is for you," the boy said. The guard hesitated for a moment before taking the notebook. Inside, the boy had drawn a picture of the guard standing tall in his uniform, with the words "My Hero" written in big, bold letters across the top. The guard's normally stoic expression softened, and he knelt down to meet the boy's gaze. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The boy beamed. "When I grow up, I want to be like you." The guard placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Be strong, be kind, and always stand for what you believe in," he said. "That's what matters most." Derek's redemption. Derek's life had changed drastically since the incident. The public backlash had been swift and unforgiving, but it had forced him to confront himself in ways he never had before. He couldn't hide from the truth anymore. His behavior had been cruel, childish, and deeply wrong. Determined to make amends, Derek began volunteering at a local community center, where he worked with teenagers struggling with anger and self-esteem issues. He shared his story with them, using his mistakes as a cautionary tale. "I thought being loud made me strong," he told them. "But I was wrong. Strength isn't about shouting the loudest or tearing others down. It's about standing firm in who you are, no matter what the world throws at you." Over time, Derek found a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. He still carried the shame of his actions, but he used it as fuel to do better. One day, he even returned to the palace square, not to provoke, but to apologize. The guard, on duty as always, didn't respond when Derek approached the edge of the crowd and left a small note on the ground. It wasn't until later, when the note was retrieved, that the guard read its contents. "I'm sorry for what I did. You showed me what real strength looks like, and I'll never forget it." The guard's reflection. Back at the barracks that evening, the guard sat alone in his quarters, the boy's drawing and Derek's note resting on the table before him. He thought of the countless faces he had seen during his time as a royal guard, faces that had smiled, jeered, or simply passed by without a second glance. And yet, these two, one a child, the other a man seeking redemption, had left a mark on him. He realized then that his duty was not just about standing still or maintaining composure. It was about being the symbol of something greater. In his silence, He had become a mirror, reflecting the best and worst in those who had confronted him. He had shown them what dignity looked like, and in doing so, he had inspired change. The legacy of the moment. The viral video eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by newer stories and fleeting trends. But for those who had witnessed it, either in person or online, the impact remained. The guard's silent strength became a quiet rallying cry for resilience, a reminder that sometimes the greatest power lies not in what we say, but in what we choose not to say. At the palace square, life continued as it always had. Tourists came and went, snapping photos and marveling at the grandeur of the scene. The guards stood at their posts, their presence of constant amidst the ever-changing crowd. And among them was the man who had stood unshaken in the face of Derek's rage. His silence a beacon of strength. He was more than just a royal guard now. He was a symbol of the power of restraint, a living reminder that dignity can weather any storm. And so he stood, silent, strong, unbroken. The closing chapter. The palace square began to fade into the soft hues of evening, the golden sunlight giving way to the dim glow of streetlights. The day had unfolded as countless others before it. Tourists milling about, guards standing at attention, and life continuing in its unbroken rhythm. Yet something intangible lingered in the air, a resonance from the events of the past weeks. The guard, who had become a silent hero in the eyes of many, prepared to conclude his shift. As he stood in the final moments of his duty, he reflected on the path that had brought him here, not just to this physical place, but to a deeper understanding of his purpose. The boy's notebook rested in his locker, alongside Derek's note of apology. He hadn't spoken of either to anyone, choosing instead to let their meanings settle quietly in his heart. For him, they were not just tokens of the day's events, they were symbols of transformation. They reminded him that his silence had been more than a personal triumph. It had sparked something larger, something he could not have anticipated. The guard's shift ended with the usual ceremony, his rifle exchanged and his uniform stored. As he left the barracks, he decided to take a quiet walk through the city. The streets were alive with the sounds of evening, the laughter of children, the hum of conversations, the distant melody of a street performer's violin. It was a reminder of life's simplicity, a stark contrast to the intensity of the square. He passed a cafe where a television played the viral video once more. He caught a glimpse of his own silent figure on the screen, standing tall and resolute against Derek's onslaught. But this time, he didn't turn away. Instead, he allowed himself to watch, not with pride or regret, but with understanding. That moment had been about more than just him. It had been about the power of restraint, the strength of enduring when it would have been easier to lash out. As he continued walking, he came across a small park. The benches were dotted with people enjoying the cool evening air. Among them, he noticed a familiar figure, Derek. The man was sitting alone, his head bowed, a notebook in his lap. His pen moved slowly across the pages, his expression one of deep concentration. The guard hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but something in Derek's posture, a quiet vulnerability, compelled him to move closer. Derek looked up as the guard approached, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Derek broke it. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said quietly, his voice devoid of the bravado it had carried before. The guard nodded once, his expression calm. He didn't speak, but his presence alone seemed to invite Derek to continue. "I've been writing," Derek said, holding up the notebook. "Trying to make sense of things. Trying to figure out who I want to be." He paused, then added, "You made me see something about myself that I didn't like. And I guess I owe you for that." The guard remained silent, his gaze steady. Derek sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. "What I did, it was awful. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be better." The guard's expression softened, and he gave a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement, a recognition of the effort Derek was making to change. Derek smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not letting me win, for showing me what real strength looks like." The guard inclined his head, a silent gesture of acceptance. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving Derek to his thoughts. The legacy lives on. In the weeks and months that followed, life at the palace square returned to its usual rhythm. But the events of that day left a lasting imprint on all who had witnessed them. The guard's silent strength became a story told not just in headlines and viral videos, but in classrooms, family dinners, and quiet conversations among friends. For the guard, the experience deepened his understanding of his duty. It was not just about standing watch or maintaining tradition. It was about embodying values that transcended words. He realized that his silence that day had been a voice louder than any shout, a voice that spoke of dignity, honor, and the power of restraint. For Derek, the confrontation became a turning point. He continued to volunteer at the community center, helping young people navigate their anger and insecurities. He became a quiet advocate for humility, often telling his story to illustrate the importance of choosing growth over ego. And for the boy with the notebook, the guard became a lifelong inspiration. He grew up with a deep respect for quiet strength, carrying the lessons of that day into his own life. Years later, as an adult, he would return to the palace square, standing among the crowd and remembering the man who had shown him what it meant to stand tall. The enduring symbol. The guard stood at his post once more, his gaze fixed ahead, his posture unyielding. The square was alive with the hum of tourists, their cameras clicking as they captured the timeless image of the royal guard. And though the faces in the crowd changed each day, the guard remained constant, a symbol of strength, dignity, and the enduring power of silence. And so he stood, silent, strong, unbroken, a beacon of what it meant to be truly human.